בין סוריה לאיראן, שכל אחת מהן חובה בימים אלה התפתחויות פנימיות דרמטיות, שוכנת מדינה גדולה נוספת שגם היא עוברת, ממש בימים אלה, תהליכים פנימיים, מדיניים וביטחוניים הרי גורל. עיראק איננה עוד המדינה שארצות הברית תכננה להקים במקום משטרו של סדאם חוסיין, עם הפלתו ב-2003 וכינון חוקה דמוקרטית. אז כדי להרחיב על התהליכים הפנימיים שקורים בעיראק, המשמעות שלהם לגבי אופי השלטון, המתחים הפנימיים, הבעיות הביטחוניות והמשמעויות של כל אלה לגבי ישראל, שוחחנו עם דוקטור מייקל נייטס, מומחה בעל שם לסוגיות ביטחוניות בעיראק ובמפרץ הפרסי, ועם אליזבת צורקוב, חוקרת ישראלית ששוחררה לפני חודשים אחדים מהשבי בעיראק. היא הוחזקה במשך יותר מ-900 ימים בידי ארגון הטרור גדודי חיזבאללה. לפניכם קטעים מהשיחה עימם, ותחילה נדון בתרחישים של הסלמה נגד ישראל משטח עיראק, ומעמדן של המיליציות הפועלות נגד ישראל שם כיום.
In terms of Iran's use of the Iraqi militias as a power projection tool, we saw during the war after October 7th how Iraq was used as a launch pad for hundreds of drones and cruise missiles. We didn't yet see the use of Iranian ballistic missiles being fired out of Iraq, but at some future point that may well be the case, because Iraq's western provinces are much closer to Israel than Iran's own borders, and it's a possibility that we could see major missile bases built up inside Iraq at some point in the future. But for now, there's three things that the Iranians use Iraq for. The first is for sanctions busting. Because the militias in Iraq control the government, they are able to control key ministries like the Ministry of Oil and the Ministry of Finance. And they're able to, for instance, smuggle Iranian oil through Iraqi waters and relabel it as Iraqi oil, and then go sell it out on the international market, but give the money back to Iran. And likewise, if Iraq wants to procure anything that's sanctioned, if Iran, wants to procure anything that's sanctioned, it can get an Iraqi ministry to order those items, computers, key oil equipment, other technologies, and bring that in through Iraq. So some people say that Iraq has become the lungs or the mouth, through which Iran is able to breathe. In terms of launchpad for the future, two things are worth talking about. The first is that the Iraqi militias will allow the Houthis from Yemen to use Iraq as a launchpad. This has already happened. We've seen a number of Houthi weapon systems fired from Iraq into Israel during the post-October 7th war, and that could come again in the future. Because again, Iraq's western desert is a lot closer than Yemen when it comes to striking Israel. And a final thing is we're starting to see the Iranians try and support Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad by sending drone systems through Iraq into Jordan and then into the West Bank. This is only at the very start, but we can expect that to happen in the future as well, because ultimately Iraq is still a land bridge, but in the future it may not be a land bridge to Assad's Syria or Lebanese Hezbollah, but instead a land bridge to Palestinian extremist groups in the West Bank.
Main use of the militias from the point of view of Tehran right now is economic, for sanctions busting, not for resistance. And this is why there were reports during the 12-day war on Iran that Iran itself did not want the Iraqi militias to participate. And even, the Iraqi militias vowed that, especially if the U.S. intervenes in the war, which it did at the end, that they will then hit American targets in the region, in Iraq. They didn't. When Iran does not present the Iraqi militias operating, under its command in Iraq as a major threat to Israel, Israel has less of a reason to go ahead and strike Iraq, to devote significant resources to tracking the activities of these militias. And now, particularly when after they've been forced out of Syria because of the fall of the regime, they're to a large extent, the smuggling route via ground to Lebanese Hezbollah has been cut or has been severely disrupted, their role, vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the US is much less significant. Of course, this depends on the behavior of Iran and the militias. If they start arming and, Iran starts moving significant assets that pose a threat to Israel, to Iraq, of course, Iraq will get hit. Given the challenges that Iran is facing in the region and domestically, their purpose now is mainly, at least that is the current policy, it could change. The main use of these militias is economic right now, to try and keep, the Iranian regime, above the water.
Iraq is unique among all the Axis of Resistance members because it actually has money and it's actually connected to the international financial system in a very robust way. Lebanon is always poor, Yemen under the Houthis, extremely poor, Palestinian areas, even Syria under the Assad regime. Whereas Iraq is, a top 5 global oil producer, that is working on a daily basis to transfer millions of US dollars back and forth. So it's an extremely valuable place. And if you think back to 2003, back then Iran had 2 major enemies. One was the Taliban in Afghanistan, who the US had just taken out, and the other was Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They have a close-in focus. Everything that happens outside with Hezbollah, with others, is a nice to have, but you have to control your neighbors more than any other type of adversary. So I think they'll always continually be interested in Iraq before any other place. Iraq is the place that hurt them the most during the Iran-Iraq war. They can never let a hostile regime take over Iraq again. They never want to let Iraq be used as a launch pad for attacks on the Iranian homeland. That's job number 1 if you're the Iranian strategic decision makers. So they will keep focused there. I think what they're trying to do at the moment is to show the Iraqi groups are harmless to America. They're harmless to Israel. Leave them alone. As Elizabeth said, Iran is not using the Iraqi militias to the maximum extent it could, because it wants to preserve that environment as a place where the Shia remain in charge and where Iran can use it for money making and for sanctions evasion.
הבחירות לפרלמנט שנערכו בחודש נובמבר האחרון עמדו בסימן התחזקותן של מיליציות שיעיות שנתמכות על ידי איראן והפכו בשנים האחרונות לחלק בלתי נפרד מהשלטון, למעשה מאתגרות את עצמאותה של עיראק מבפנים, גם בהקשר של העימות האזורי בין הציר השיעי בהובלת איראן לישראל, שבו המיליציות האלה לקחו חלק פעיל בשנתיים האחרונות עם שיגורי טילים וכטב"מים לישראל ועוד קודם לכן.
Their major growth occurred quite recently in terms of membership and in terms of the resources that they're able to accumulate. And this occurred only after essentially the defeat of ISIS, after Mosul was liberated from ISIS, and many of the Iraqi Shia men who volunteered to go and fight against ISIS, many of them returned home after the fight was over. But the militias that significantly expanded during this period of fighting ISIS remained in place. They had several tens of thousands of fighters. There are different estimates, 60,000 fighters, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. But then they became part of the state. In 2016, they were officially incorporated as if they are under the command of the prime minister, when in reality they're not. And began, formally receiving salaries that go to fighters. And basically, because the political clique that has ruled Iraq now, since 2005 or so, has failed to create any kind of robust private sector, there are no jobs. Unemployment is rife in Iraq, and people are looking for jobs. And one of the most lucrative options that is out there is to join a militia. You receive a monthly salary, and in addition to that, from that is paid, by the Iraqi state. And additionally, if you're in a militia, that gives you power to lord over society occasionally in some roles. It gives you the ability to extract illicit funds. You set up a checkpoint and start collecting illegal taxes, and no one is going to say no. You're going to go and extort from a business. And most of this money goes up the chain, but some of it remains for the individuals involved in this criminal activity. So this is when we saw really a rapid expansion of the militias from about 60,000 fighters to now 250,000. The numbers are opaque. Many of these individuals don't actually show up to work. They sit at home and collect a salary. They've amassed, billions of dollars that they were then able to also spend on buying votes from people who are not affiliated with the militia and wouldn't otherwise vote. They simply bought their votes through sometimes just cash handouts, through hiring them as electoral observers, when in reality they're not observing anything. They're just getting paid for their vote, for the votes of their family members. So basically, their significant rise and expansion in the ranks and the wealth that they've amassed is not very much linked to Iran. It is much more linked to basically embedding themselves into the Iraqi state and sucking resources from it in the form of salaries and in the form of contracts that are awarded to companies linked to them, extortion of all sorts.
After this last election in November 2025, we now have not only a majority of seats in Parliament held by the Shia, which is perfectly fine and normal, but we have 10% of Iraqi MPs now come from US-designated terrorist organizations. That's an unprecedented situation. And the US has signaled, even though it can't undo the results of the election, wouldn't want to, it does have a block right now on any of those Shia militant actors becoming prime minister or ministers within the new cabinet. So that kind of underlines, I think, how far from the original vision we've fallen. It didn't become a relatively liberal democracy. It became instead a kind of military junta run by militia politicians who are very good at using elections every 4 years to legitimize their rule. And that's a key thing to think about here. Being in the Popular Mobilization Forces and the other Iraqi militias is almost like being part of an association in which you get long-term benefits for having been a member and for giving your vote and your support. In many ways, I think it reminds of, and it's modeled on, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran and the Basij movement, because it's almost like a veterans movement that says, we gave some service, now for the rest of our lives, we will receive payback from the state. And as a result, the PMF and the militias have created what is essentially a parallel judicial system where they are tried within the PMF military courts. They have an independent economic conglomerate that they are building out, same as Khatam al-Anbiya in Iran, which is the Revolutionary Guard super company that wins billions of dollars worth of contracts. So, you can see that the model from Iran has been duplicated inside Iraq in a way that allows anyone who joins the militias to receive lifetime benefits. And they feel as if the state owes them something, in the same way that the Revolutionary Guard members were told the state owes you for your service in the Iran-Iraq war. Taking that apart is extremely difficult.
השלטון בעיראק כיום רחוק מלייצג את רצון רוב הציבור העיראקי, ועל כך מעיד שיעור ההצבעה הנמוך משמעותית בבחירות האחרונות ביחס למערכות בחירות קודמות בשנים שאחרי מיטוט משטרו של סדאם חוסיין. הממשלה והמוסדות הציבוריים בכלל נגועים בשחיתות שמעוררת סלידה מהשלטון בחלקים נרחבים מהציבור.
The actual turnout is quite low. There was a slight bump in the turnout from 36% of people above the age of 18 in the previous elections to 37.5%, where the turnout in the Shia areas was actually the lowest compared to Sunni and Kurdish ones. Again, a testament to kind of this sense of malaise and this is pointless to vote, etc. Still, merely through the brute force of buying votes, of giving people, the sums varied from, $50 to more, depending on how rich the district is and the ferocity of the competition there. But basically, there was massive vote buying. This is how really they managed to get people to turn out, by clientelism, by buying people's loyalty and votes, not due to actual, popularity of these ruling parties. Even people who are members of these parties, who vote for them, hate their parties, or at least hate the political system in which they're operating. I had people in captivity holding me who are members of a militia who are complaining about al-Ahzab, the parties, about how they're ruining Iraq. Like, you're a member of this. But everyone is unhappy with the system, with the exception of a very, very few who've become millionaires off of it.
I used to be quite an optimistic person about Iraq, but the more I learned about how the elite really works inside, the less optimistic I became. Because even people who I thought were technocrats or who were nationalists eventually got swallowed by this militia system, which is really about looting the country until there's nothing left. You don't have any opposition in Iraq at the moment, and there's a very active effort to prevent a civilian, youth-led opposition from forming. We saw in 2019, there were very large-scale protests, and the militias put those protests down. And since then, they've worked really hard in terms of their control of the internet, the media, the university systems, to try and prevent a youth uprising from ever happening again. And, at the moment, there's no way to compete against them in elections. And there's really, at the moment, no way to compete against the militias outside of elections either.
מעבר להתפתחויות האלה, לפני, תוך כדי וגם אחרי הבחירות, עיראק הייתה ונותרה מוקד של מתיחות אזורית גוברת בין ארצות הברית לאיראן.
We are in a moment of opportunity in Iraq because of the regional changes. In particular, because the militias got kind of show and tell of what, Western, US and Israeli intelligence and firepower can achieve elsewhere. So they are really scared. This is something that I observed while in captivity, and this is something that is evident, since coming out. Leaders of 4 different militias issued statements that they're clearly not intended to actually follow through with it, but basically indicated, yes, we're willing to kind of hand over the weapons to the state, but we're the state. So kind of it's very, basically these statements are intended to placate the Americans, to show we are not a threat, we are playing ball. And this is not, this is not a result of, them changing their mind. This is because they're genuinely scared. And I think that the new U.S. envoy to Iraq, Mark Savaya, the language that he has used has definitely kind of, elevated the sense of fear that they feel, and also his involvement in my own release that, occurred through him, threatening the leadership of Qatar Hezbollah through the Iraqi prime minister, that if they don't release me within a week, they will be killed. So they released me within a week. For 900 days, they kept demanding a huge ransom or some other benefits. They just gave that up and released me because they're afraid. the leadership understand that they are alive because simply the US and Israel have decided not to kill them yet. Not because they lack the ability to find them. They understand that the axis is entirely penetrated.
עכשיו, כשממשל טראמפ מוטרד מהתרחבות תופעת מדינת המיליציות בעיראק, ודורש מהממשלה בבגדד לפרק אותן מנשקן ולהימנע משיתופן בשלטון, זה עלול להכניס את המדינה העיראקית לסחרור, במיוחד אם ארצות הברית תנסה לאכוף את דרישתה מהממשלה, למשל בסנקציות או בתקיפה צבאית.
I'd say in terms of things to watch in the next year, you can watch the following. The first is who is picked as Iraq's prime minister by the factions, and what kind of people are the ministers within the cabinet. It's going to be obvious to experts whether the Iraqi prime minister and his ministers are very close to the militias or have been deliberately distanced from the militias in a more meaningful way. You know, you can pick somebody who is a militiaman in all but name, or you can pick somebody who is a technocrat who will have some ability to reduce the amount of militia penetration in the state. The question is really whether the US cares, if it's one or the other. So the Trump administration will have to pay attention to the details of who has been picked as the prime minister and who are the ministers. I think a second thing to watch for is whether the US begins to regularly put sanctions on Iraqi economic institutions, again, potentially including parts of the oil ministry. If they do, that indicates that the US, again, is paying attention and it does not want to allow Iraqi militias to control billions of dollars of terrorism threat financing. The final thing to watch is whether the Iraqis can be successful in essentially bribing the Americans to not care. And they would do that by, for instance, providing them with very large economic contracts that would make the Trump administration say, we don't really care who runs Iraq, they're doing good things for us. These are all the sorts of things that I'm going to be watching, and you can see the common theme in all of them is, does the US still care if Iran continues to grow its influence in Iraq? Or after the war, between Israel, the US and Iran, does the US think of Iran as successfully contained and no longer really a level one threat?
So therefore, the US has a great deal of tools that it previously didn't have before, these regional changes. They're definitely much more scared. And they're also the economic sanctions that are on the table. The decision really, as Mike pointed out brilliantly, is whether it decides to use those tools. And to what an extent it is able to calibrate the pressure and, follow through and see, okay, this is the prime minister. These are the ministries. What are they doing? How are they evading sanctions? How are they serving Iran? To really contain Iranian influence. But the tools are there. It's a question of whether the tools are used and to what an extent it is done immediately.
No, they're trying to reintegrate themselves with the Arab world, but of course the main Arab states, which are all almost entirely Sunni, did not accept a new Shia-led Iraq after 2003, and they spent at least 10 years isolating the new Iraq instead of embracing it and bringing it into the Arab world. And as a result, Iran really went towards the Iranian orbit. Iraq went towards the Iranian orbit and, the US orbit instead of having a strong Arab influence. And even though there's a bit more effort nowadays to incorporate Iraq into the Arab world and into the Turkish, economic system, it's still not trusted. And now that you have Syria as a major Arab state that's returning to the Arab fold, those states they're excited about what's happening in Syria and Lebanon, and they're not excited about what's happening in Iraq. So, they have an option now to choose a Sunni-led Arab state to be their connecting point between the Gulf and Europe, and they don't necessarily need Iraq to be that connecting point anymore.
כפועל יוצא של המעורבות האיראנית בעיראק, המדינה הזו מהווה כיום חזית בשירות הציר השיעי בהובלת איראן, והיא עשויה לשוב ולשמש את איראן דרך המיליציות הנאמנות לה גם בתקופה הקרובה.